These are very dedicated people here tonight, given the weather situation outside. So thank you, extra special thank you for coming. I'm just going to do a brief introduction. My name is Meredith Cruz. I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Disciples Foundation. The event tonight is IDF Activist Forum. Our speaker is Mike Doyle. Mike Doyle is a tireless advocate for grassroots change in our community. I'm very excited to have him speak tonight and share the lessons that he's learned and give us some advice for the future. I'm looking forward to hearing his words, and then also there will be time for people to ask questions afterwards. Just a little bit about the concept behind the IDF Activist Forum. Several times a year the IDF brings in activists from our community to share a personal autobiography. It's hoped that their stories will serve as a source of inspiration for us. They can give us some political analysis, and then we can also have time for community building. Part of the community building is eating food together too. So if you haven't already, please help yourself to, we have scones back here and cookies and coffee. So again, the Activist Forum, it's the idea we should remember that it's people like us who are making change. Never underestimate the power of collective struggle to enact the change that we desire. So as I was saying, I'm the director of the Illinois Disciples Foundation. As many of you know, the IDF has been working for peace with justice for over half a century. I've been here 2 months and I've been learning a lot, and it's been fascinating about the history of the IDF. So we've been active in the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. We've been involved in the sanctuary struggle in the 1980s, the anti-chief movement, the women's rights movement, and struggles continue today. The struggles continuing today are primarily carried out through our programs. Many of you are probably familiar with them. The Progressive Resource Action Cooperative, the Women's Direct Action Collective, the Common Ground Food Co-op, Uprisings, and others. We have lots of information on the programs outside the door here at the literature table. We also have a brochure about the IDF, so you can look at that. Just some quick announcements about things our programs are doing. I have visual aids for you also. So the Progressive Resource Action Cooperative, this is a flyer about their upcoming event. They're going to be having an anti-militarism panel. It's going to be this Saturday, March 2nd at 1 p.m. Barry Romo, who is a national coordinator with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, will be speaking, so come out to that if you can. Also, the Women's Direct Action Collective is going to be having a planning meeting for Take Back the Night. People are probably familiar with this. It's an annual rally in March to protest sexual violence and the oppression of women, and their planning meeting is going to be Tuesday, March 5th at 7 p.m. here at the IDF, so you can come out to that. Also, the IDF is going to be having a benefit concert this Sunday, pink flyer, and that's out there also. The benefit concert is going to be at the High Dive. It's from 9 till 1. Some bands playing are going to be The Violence, Roscoe Plush, and others. And then finally, this off-white flyer, and we've done some fun things with Uncle Sam, like put a peace sign on his hat. The IDF is hiring CMA positions for starting next August. So if you know anybody who's looking for housing, free housing for 10 hours of work a week, you get to help with the programs and fundraising, and it's a great way to earn, get some free housing and help with social justice movements. So right now I'm just going to move on to a brief introduction of, we're going to have two people kind of do introductions of Mike Doyle, since he has this incredible legacy, and I'm new. You get two extra special introductions. The first person that's going to speak is Claudia Lenhoff. She is Executive Director of the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers. She's also on the board here at the IDF and active with several committees. So she's going to talk briefly about Mike's role with healthcare consumers, which is celebrating their 25th anniversary this year. So, Claudia.
Thank you very much. As Meredith said, I'm the Executive Director of the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers, and I'm a board member here at the Illinois Disciples Foundation. Healthcare Consumers is very pleased to help support this event tonight. As many of you know, Mike Doyle is a founding member and a current board member of the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers, and as Meredith said, we're celebrating our 25-year anniversary this year. We're a grassroots citizen action organization dedicated to working for social justice with a particular focus on health care. I want to tell you a little bit about the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers And in doing so, I hope to pay tribute to and honor Mike Doyle's work over the past 25 years, and then say just a few personal words about Mike. Healthcare Consumers is founded on the premise of participatory democracy, which is something you'll hear Mike talk about this evening. Mike's like, oh my God, he's scribbling notes. Although we focus primarily on healthcare issues, our main mission goal is to instill in community members the knowledge, skills, commitment, and action of participatory democracy. And we do that by struggling collectively for justice, primarily in healthcare. We work to ensure that consumers have a voice in the healthcare system, and we believe and have seen that meaningful change in the healthcare system only comes with the active participation of consumers and through community involvement. We believe that healthcare is a basic human right and that all people should have access to quality, affordable healthcare. Our work is guided by the 3 principles of direct action organizing. And those are, we work to give people a sense of their own power, we work to make concrete improvements in people's lives, and we work to alter the relations of power. Over the past 25 years, Healthcare Consumers has had many incredible victories in fighting for healthcare justice. Many of you are familiar with our victories and have participated in those struggles to end Medicaid discrimination at local clinics, stop a nursing home from dumping Medicaid patients, organizing to create our local countywide public health department, fighting medical billing injustices, and most recently, a victory at the U of I in our contraceptive coverage campaign led by the Women's Health Task Force, just to name a few. There are not many organizations like Healthcare Consumers around the country. And actually, among consumer organizations and health advocacy organizations, CCHCC has a national reputation as being the most effective organization of its kind in the country. Famous national figures like Ralph Nader and leaders of national organizations know Mike and credit Healthcare Consumers' success and longevity to Mike's organizing skills. And I know this firsthand because many times when I'm out participating in national conferences and people come to greet me as a representative of Healthcare Consumers, they'll say, oh, Champaign County Healthcare Consumers, Mike Doyle's organization, how's Mike doing? And so he's very closely associated with Healthcare Consumers. Now, I want to say a few things about Mike and why I'm so pleased that he agreed to present at this activist forum. And I know that he did this out of fellowship for the IDF, as we are sister organizations and working for social justice. I know that Mike is uncomfortable being here, and in particular, I think he is uncomfortable hearing others speak of him and then having to speak about himself and his work. Mike is one of the most humble and understated people whom I have ever met. But Mike Doyle is, without question, you can cover your ears if you don't want to hear this, is without question one of the most brilliant, visionary, hardworking, and effective community organizers I have ever known. And all of us who work with Mike at Healthcare Consumers or through the Public Interest Fund of Illinois or many of the other groups he is associated with are very proud to work with him and eager to have the opportunity to learn from doing so. I think it is very important that Mike is speaking here this evening because I believe that we live in a society that actively discourages participatory democracy and community organizing in particular. Listening to Mike and learning what he has to say and what choices he has made in his life that enable him to continue to work for justice at a low wage is important for those of us who also must make choices about how to live our lives in the pursuit of justice and who want to build community in this particular way. What kind of an activist is Mike Doyle? To my mind, Mike Doyle is a community organizer. In other words, Mike dedicates his work to mobilizing other people in order to work for justice in our community. Community organizing to protect and to encourage participatory democracy around issues of justice that people care about is hard work. It requires incredible personal discipline, it is not glamorous work, and it is not well-paid work. We all love a good protest, but organizing a good protest is easy compared to mobilizing hundreds or thousands of people to dedicate their time and energy and resources to an ongoing effort that will not be won overnight, will not be won from one good protest, and may not even be won in 1 year. Mike Doyle has not only organized for amazing community victories, but he has helped to create more than one organization in this community dedicated to working to ensure and promote participatory democracy in the fight for justice. Imagine the capacity to actually help create a number of organizations whose self-interest is the people's interest, and which are created in such a way that they continue to survive and thrive by being responsive to people's needs, and by fostering and supporting participatory democracy and building leadership in this community. These organizations, including Healthcare Consumers, are avenues for people who care about justice and who want to fight against injustice to find ways that their individual participation makes a huge difference. From working with these organizations and in these struggles, people learn the joy and the success of being an individual working in collective struggle. Mike Doyle will be the first person to say that he did not do all this alone, and that is absolutely true. There are many people here this evening who are longtime, dedicated, and powerful community organizers and activists in their own right. And the point is exactly right, that Mike Doyle did not do it alone. Mike Doyle is a community organizer who works in struggle with others to achieve real victories and to protect democracy in our community. And because of his activism, he is doing it less and less alone, and more as more and more of us join and struggle. And I think that's probably the best tribute that anybody could give to Mike Doyle. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Are you introducing Imani? Should I introduce? Imani Bazel is actually doing the real introduction of Healthcare Consumers. I took this, I'm sorry, Mike Doyle, that was a Freudian slip. I took the opportunity to try to say a few words of Healthcare Consumers because we are in our 25th year. But come on.
Well, good evening. I'm not sure what else to say now, Miss Claudia. Well, I am very pleased to see everyone come out this evening, though I didn't doubt that I would see at least this many people, because we know that Mike deserves at least this large of audience. So when I was asked to introduce Mike, I knew all the things he had done, but I think people are less interested in what he's done than in what it all means. How do you be a long-distance runner? What does it take to be a long-distance runner? How does one manage to establish ongoing, life-giving, and life-sustaining organizations and campaigns like CCHCC, Champaign County Healthcare Consumers, like ICCI, the Illinois Center for Citizen Involvement, like FAIR, Families Advocating Injury Reduction, like UCAN, United Citizens and Neighbors, and like PIFI, the Public Interest Fund of Illinois. It's not just what people have done, but what the work means. Our challenge as educators and organizers is to win real improvements in people's lives, and I think probably more importantly, to give people a sense of their own power. And so this is what stands out for me the most when I reflect on Mike and what he means to me and what I believe he means to others in this community. Really, this idea of giving people a sense of their own power. Because his energy, his passion, his vision, his straight-up thinking and organizing skills are what make him the treasure that he is in our community. To do this well, though, you have to have deep respect and abiding love for your family and friends, and they in turn support and inspire you to sustain your commitment to being a long-distance runner. And so to reiterate Claudia's point, we don't do this alone, and Mike would never claim to have done it alone. And that's one of the things I want us to think about tonight as we listen to what Mike has to share with us about 30 years of long-distance running. Listen closely, not just to what he's done, but the message about what it takes to support a long-distance runner. The message about what we need to learn about supporting new and future activists so they can be long-distance runners for social justice. And one of the other things I want us to keep in mind is to think about, there's this idea that somebody who's sort of not in our circle of activists but whom I respect greatly for the work he's done, Stephen Covey, who's really a corporate guy. But he talks about this idea of an emotional bank account. Has anyone ever heard that idea? Yes. From me, oh, okay. I'm repeating myself. No, it's a good concept. And the idea here is that in our relationships with individuals, or maybe in this case in the community, we are making deposits in other people's emotional bank accounts, meaning where we live in their lives and what we mean to them. And we need to be really conscious about making those deposits, the compliments, the good things, the important things that allow people to trust us and rely on us. And one of the reasons it's really important is because we aren't always right. We aren't always on task. Sometimes we actually make mistakes. But the thing that allows us to maintain our reputation and maintain our course is that we've been making ongoing deposits in that emotional bank account. And so now and then we get to make a withdrawal. But if you aren't doing that on a regular basis, when it comes time to make a withdrawal, you may find the bank account empty. And that's one thing I admire about Mike, is that he makes ongoing deposits in our emotional bank account. And so he can afford to take a break, he can afford to slip up now and then, because he's made enough deposits that we will still trust in him and believe in him and support him in the work that he does, which is making our lives better and making this community a better place to live. So thank you, Mike, and come and share a little with us.
So I just need to make sure that I can get a copy of that tape for my mother. She loves to hear stuff like that. And thank you both for very nice words. And thank for all of you for coming out tonight. My voice is a little bit deeper. I have a bit of a head cold, so if you don't mind bearing with me on that. I guess I want to start with just a quick quote, because I think it sort of frames sort of the world, I think. And it's from Frederick Douglass in 1849. If you've seen the Healthcare Consumer t-shirt, it has part of this quote on there, but not the whole thing, and I think the whole thing says a lot. So 150 some years ago, Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And this will continue till they have resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those who they suppress." Sort of the marketplace of power, I guess. But there is this sense that we get the need to organize, to respond to what will happen is essential in everything, and that what comes down, I mean, there's many times when you're out there and you're sort of struggling, and what ends up coming down, what you have to deal with, is really what the other side will just keep taking until you say enough is enough, and I want to change that. And I guess for a lot of what I've done over the last 25 or 30 years has been working with people who have reached the point where they're saying enough is enough. I want to change that. What I'd like to do a little bit is give a little, I was asked to give some personal biography information about how I got where I came from, or where I came from and how I got to where I am now. My own experience, you know, when I think back to me when I first got exposed to organizing, actually, I'm from the south side of Chicago, sort of a middle-class family, but I was a caddy at Ridge Country Club, so this is my first organizing experience. So I was 11 or 12 years old. But, and the caddies, you know, we carried the golf bags around for all the rich guys in the country club. And we got paid pretty poor wages. Now, I was a young guy, and I wasn't one of the sort of the leaders of this, but it was, again, my first experience. And the caddies went on strike at Ridge Country Club, and we all walked off the job, and we marched down and went to 7-Eleven and got candy, but we walked off the job. And within a day, the country club conceded and gave like 40% raises for everyone. Wow. It was like, whoa, it was pretty cool. So as an 11-year-old, that was like the first experience about what this is all about, you know, back to Frederick Douglass, you know. They'll give you whatever you will take, and if you demand more, sometimes you can get more. So that was sort of my first experience. I don't think I quite realized it till later on in life when I sort of reflected back on that. And I was, again, sort of a follower in that. I certainly wasn't the leader of it. But I think it was very insightful in terms of, and an early lesson that I learned that, you know, you sort of get what you demand, and if you're not demanding something, then you're not going to get it in the first place. But my upbringing really on the south side of Chicago, you know, I'm a little, just sort of missed the anti-war stuff. I sort of caught the end of that, but I'm a little young for that, fortunately. But my exposure when I was young was growing up in the south side of Chicago. We had a neighborhood organizer in our church that was working around neighborhood issues. So I sort of had some exposure to that. Again, I wasn't really actively involved, but sort of saw it then. But probably the most profound influence on me was my stepfather, who was an ex-Jesuit priest and married my mother when I was about 13 years old, 14 years old. I guess it was a little older than that, but he was as a Jesuit at the time when we first got to know Bill, and worked with the Berrigan brothers, who were very involved in the anti-war protests, so we would have sort of those stories of the Berrigan brothers and their protests against the Vietnam War. And then later in the late 60s and early 70s, he worked with a sort of an infamous organizer named Saul Linsky on the south side of Chicago and with some of his organizations. So Bill would come over to our house at the time. He wasn't married to my mom, and he would talk about some of the things that he was involved with. So we were sitting around the dinner table and would hear these organizing stories and fighting for justice and trying to challenge the way things are and make them better for people. So that was sort of my upbringing, and I was fortunate because I think it gave me some exposure to the kind of work I'm doing now, although at the time it was just an experience and I wasn't really thinking about this is what I want to do. Much of that didn't come till later. When I came here to the U of I, my degree is actually in urban planning. You know, I came here and my goal was to get good grades. I dropped out of school for a while, sort of came back, get my degree, and then maybe go to law school and do something. But as I got involved here in urban planning, and it sort of crystallized some of my understandings of the world. You know, urban planners are these people who are trying to make the world nice and neat and organized and make the best decisions, which way the street should go, where the expansion should be. And it's very sort of technical, and you want to evaluate this and get your statistics and your numbers and do your studies and then come up with the best possible plan. Well, the truth of the matter is when urban planners are out there doing stuff, they're making decisions, and every one of those decisions that they're making and recommending to the city council or the county or whoever has a winner and a loser. Someone's going to benefit from these decisions and someone's going to pay some for this. And one of the challenges in urban planning was, well, you know, how do you decide? I mean, it isn't always the best one way to do it. It's like, well, if we do it this way, these people will benefit. If we do it that way, those people will benefit. And too often in the history of urban planning, the people without power who weren't at the table when the plans were being drawn up ended up being the losers, and they ended up paying a little bit more. Either their houses were torn down or their neighborhoods were destroyed. And the winners were people with power who had the opportunity to sit at the table, talk to the planners, explain why it should go this way, how they should benefit. And they often owned the land or had ways of benefiting financially from it. So there was always this dynamic that went on in urban planning about, you know, what decision is the right decision. And then the question for planners was, well, I'm sitting here talking to the power elite in our community as we're making up plans, the bankers and the leaders of our community, the Chamber of Commerce. What about the folks down the road? Do they really know what's going on? Is anyone representing their interests? And, you know, planners can only advocate so much in a non-political way because the powers that be who have the votes on the council or the relationship with the mayor oftentimes will sort of get their way. And it's not that they're evil or bad, they're just good business. They're lobbying for their interests. And when the people who are making the decisions are listening to it, they're hearing that side. But what about the voiceless part of the community, the people out there who don't have opportunity to do that? So that just really interests me and sort of, you know, brought me back to things that were basic values in my upbringing about social justice and fairness and equity. And it was really out of that background in urban planning that got me involved again in organizing. This time as more of a career thing than sort of as an observer at a caddy at a country club. The dynamic of getting involved, this will be the sort of the last of my personal biography stuff, was the healthcare consumers actually started as a class project. So for those of you who go to the U of I, it was a study that we were doing, looking at getting community involvement into health planning agencies. And we went out and talked to people in the community and did a report about how consumers aren't involved in healthcare issues. And again, the interests, the doctors, the hospitals, even the nurses made sure that their point of view was being represented in this, but the broad consumer constituency was unaware of the agency and how to get involved or what difference it would make in their lives. So we recommended that one of the things that needed to be done was there needed to be a consumer group who would be out there representing consumer interests. And it was out of that class And out of that report that that class did, that actually the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers began 25 years ago this season, this spring that's coming up. So that's sort of how I got involved, being one of the students in the class. I was not interested in producing something that got me a good grade. I was much more interested in trying to make that work in the community. I think that's a challenge for those of us who are thinking about getting into activism, is taking it the next step, finding a way in which you can engage yourself in the community around an issue, and that is not where the point where the teacher's still giving you grades, and it's not the point often when you're getting paid. It's the point where you're sort of putting a little blood and sweat into it that goes beyond what you're getting officially reimbursed for. So the Healthcare Consumers was sort of the beginning of that for me, and as Amani mentioned, I've been involved in starting and being help nurturing a lot of organizations, and again, it's sort of hearing people and listening to them and what they want to do and talking to them and sort of bringing my experiences with other organizations to start new groups. But as we get involved in organizations and get involved in issues, there are the three principles. I think Amani touched on them and Claudia mentioned them, but for me are sort of the benchmarks of doing organizing. So when sort of go out there and you're doing all this stuff, how do you know if it's making a difference? Because sometimes it is a long haul and it goes on forever. So the three principles that both of my introducers mentioned, I think are fundamental. And as we look at organizing, we need to be looking at these three principles and sort of measuring what we're doing against them. Now I'm getting old. I have to put on my glasses to read my notes here. I sort of know these by heart, but it's good to see them on paper. One is to make concrete improvements in people's lives. And this is almost like, well, of course, that's what you should be doing, right? But too often, there are times when those of us who are into activism are into the protest part of it, as Claudia mentioned, and we're not thinking about what difference it's going to make. And it really, you know, sitting there and thinking, where's everyone at the meeting? I mean, that's one of the reasons why people should get involved and do get involved, is whether or not it's going to make a difference in their life. I've got 4 kids. 3 of them are going to be in college next year, and one's going to be in 3rd grade, but you know, it's a drain having a family. I mean, it's great energizing, but there's a lot of effort that goes into it. There's PTA meetings, there's teacher conferences, there's just lots of things, sick kids. And people who are out there are struggling with all these kinds of everyday issues. And so for them to go to a meeting, it really has to have some, like, why would I get up and go out on a cold night just to go to some meeting? People's experiences are often reinforced by that sense of being powerlessness. It's one of the biggest things organizers and activists try to overcome, is this sense of, I can't fight City Hall, I can't make a difference. I mean, that's what people feel. Too often, organizers get in there and say, oh, that's not true, it will make a difference. But the truth of the matter is, they've been there. They've had institutions sort of dump on them. They've had this experience where you can't do it. And that's not that they're just pessimistic. It's sort of been learned about how our society and large institutions would sort of dictate the society and control things. They've been beaten down a number of times. So there's really a challenge for organizers to help redefine that experience, to allow people to understand that you can make a difference and that it's going to lead to concrete improvements in your life. So let me give an example. There were some of these I might have passed around, people might have gotten, and this is something that Amani was, I think it was the first time we really worked together closely. It was probably about 10 years ago when Christie Clinic was discriminating against Medicaid patients. And so there was this campaign that went on over several months. It started when a woman came into our office. She had been on, she was pregnant, she was about 8.5 months pregnant. Her husband lost her job. She had to go on Medicaid. She called up Christie to make her appointment, you know, for her next prenatal visit, and said, oh, by the way, I'm going to be on Medicaid because my husband lost the job. They said, oh, guess what? We're full. We don't take any Medicaid patients. You're now what we call a Medicaid patient. We have a quota of Medicaid patients. I'm sorry, you can't come in here. And so here's a woman who is pregnant, she's ready to have her baby, and suddenly her doctor says, or the institution her doctor works for says, you're not welcome here anymore. And out of that came a whole set of policies that we became aware of about how people were being turned away just because they were reliant on Medicaid. And the campaign took a lot of different turns, and going to the city council and challenging Christie's policies on a variety of levels. What this article talks a little bit about from the newsletter and emphasizes, I mean, there's this big protest that went on, this big march through the community and over to Christie Clinic. But on the backside of it, it looks at what was happening when the campaign went on for a while. And I guess I just want to point out, in 1990 at Christie Clinic, 111 Medicaid patients per doctor, if you added them all up and did it. In the non-Christie doctors, they were seeing 292 Medicaid patients per doctor. By 91, Christie was still behind others, but they had doubled the number of Medicaid patients per doctor that they were seeing there. And also, if you looked at OBGYN, from 89, they had about 1,000 Medicaid patient visits in their OBGYN department. When our campaign started by 1990, it had gone up to 3,000. And when we were in full bloom in 91, it had gone almost to 5,000 Medicaid patient visits in their OBGYN department. So it was a five-fold increase. And I point this out because, again, it isn't so much just about the protest, but the protest is a means or a mechanism for getting Christie Clinic to change its policies so that people who couldn't get into the healthcare system now can get into the healthcare system. And it's a critical thing that what we do has to lead to things that are better for people. Because why are they going to leave their family? Why are they going to take time out unless it's going to make a difference? If you talk to people about those things that are real for them and how you can make that better, that's really what engages people. And I think it's a wonderful victory that healthcare consumers just had of getting birth control for women who work at the university. It's not everything that they want, but that's a real difference. I know it from my own life. That's a real difference in people's lives. It's real dollars that are going out of their pocket that are now going to be able to stay there because of that effort. And that's one of the things that drives organizing. If you're not doing that, I think you have to question what it's about. And I remember seeing this thing on 60 Minutes many years ago. It was back in the mid-'80s during Ronald Reagan's term, and there were some protests in Pennsylvania. And I never was sure if this was 60 Minutes' portrayal of it or if this was it, but there was this group that was fighting against the corporations, and they took some blood and they threw it on some local corporate executives. No, it wasn't blood, it was just dyed water, but they sort of threw it there, and there was all these tactics, and they're very aggressive. And at the time, they interviewed the organizer and said, well, what are you doing this for? And he says, we just want them to make them feel the pain that our people feel. And I guess that's good, but for me, it sort of misses the point that if you're not making a difference, if you're not winning some concrete changes from those corporate executives, that just the tactic in and of itself, it'll go away, it'll burn out. People will not just come to ridicule someone else. There has to be some way, some concrete thing that you're making better for people, and that's what really gets people to come out and get involved in things. The second principle is that giving people a sense of their own power, and this really speaks to the tactics that we use. And I remember the healthcare consumers, and this again is sort of an early one, but one that helped me sort of have an insight into some of this, where we were, Mercy Hospital at the time, again, was discriminating against Medicaid patients. They were double billing them. Even though they got reimbursed from the state, they would send out what the state didn't pay them in a bill to the Medicaid recipients. And so we had heard about this, and we're setting up a meeting, and set up a meeting with the president of the hospital. And it was in a room of probably about half this size. His name was Ron Aldrich, and we showed up with probably about 75 people. And it was a very intense meeting, and people were sort of challenging him. He was sitting up in the front with some of our leaders. People were asking him questions, and you know, I always remember this. They were sending out these bills, and so people would say, you know, what about this? How come I'm getting this bill, and you shouldn't be doing this? And at one point, Mr. Aldrich stopped and said, you know, you're all making these charges, and I just want to say to you that we run this institution as if he were running this institution. He pointed to the crucifix up on the wall over at Mercy Hospital. And he said, you know, if he wouldn't do it, we wouldn't be doing it. And people would say, well, I've got this bill and this. Well, 2 days later, despite all his denials that they were doing anything wrong, he came before a community forum that we had set up and announced that, in fact, they had discovered where the problem was. It was in a computer. And the computer was spitting out these bills. And so there was one thing where I realized that computers probably aren't Catholic or Christian, and they didn't have those values. But so the idea was in 2 days, he ended the policy, ended the practice. They agreed not to do it anymore. But in the healthcare consumers, I mean, the headline in the paper the next day was Consumer Group's Tactics Question. And it was all about how we were mean to him, and we put him on the spot, and it was intense, and it was unfair. He wasn't prepared. He didn't know why we were there initially. And it was all about that. And inside healthcare consumers, this debate, well, gee, maybe we should have done this because the coverage is bad. We're being criticized for this. And I always remember it, that there was sort of this give and take at the healthcare consumer meeting, and there was someone who, Elsie Easley, I don't know if anyone knows Elsie, she's now out in Sacramento, but she was here in town, and she said, I'm glad you weren't fighting for my civil rights to people who felt like we'd done the wrong thing. Because some people's approach was, well, gee, you know, Mike, couldn't you have gotten on the phone and called up Mr. Aldrich and said, gee, we're aware of this problem, and let him know, and he would have looked into it, and he would have solved it, and couldn't that have been the way that we solved this? Do we have to do it in front of the media? Do we have to do it in such an aggressive way? And part of it was, you know, it might have actually worked that way. I might have been able to get Mr. Aldrich on the phone. I don't know that he would have taken my phone call, but I might have. Might have been able to explain the problem. He might have looked into it. I don't know that within 48 hours he would have turned it around and solved the problem, but he might have actually done it. The difference would have been, if it would have worked that way, is it would have sort of reinforced what people sort of think is, oh, I know Mike Doyle, he's that guy on TV, and of course he can meet with the president of the hospital and all that sort of stuff. That's how it changes. I can't do anything. I'm powerless to do it. But when we had the room filled with individuals who were affected by the problem and they were confronting him, and 2 days later when he announced that it was changing, all those people who were in that at that meeting, they had that sense of that power. By participating in that tactic, by them making the demands rather than me making a phone call meeting on the side, they suddenly understood that they could make a difference, that it was worth going to the planning meetings, and it was worth challenging Mr. Aldrich, because things do change when you do that stuff. So it's important that you make concrete improvements in people's life, but it's important also that we think about the tactics that we use so that people can experience the success of victory, the excitement of that, and the difference it can make, because we're beaten down so often about how you can't make a difference, that when people actually win, it's energizing. And I think that's one of the things that keeps me doing this, is being around people who sort of just blossom and take off and, you know, feel frustrated, but suddenly have a sense of, I can make a difference. And I think of people like Louise White or Henrietta DeBoer, wonderful women and people in the community who just emerge as great, strong leaders on behalf of themselves and the community. And part of that comes from participating in events and activities where they get to be the spokesperson and the person who's involved in it. So the second thing is making sure as we're organizing that people are having the opportunity to understand that it's their participation that really is where the power comes from, and get them to experience that and feel that. And that's why people remain engaged in organizing. And I think that's part of the success of groups like Healthier Consumers, is constantly that focus on giving people the sense of their own power and focusing on concrete improvements in people's lives. The third principle that we look at is really altering the relationships of power. And that's something that's a little more amorphous, but for me it's sort of building community institutions. It's the idea that before there was a healthcare consumers, when the healthcare providers were doing stuff, they didn't really think about, well, what's the healthcare consumers going to say? I mean, they did what they're going to do. They think, well, what are the doctors going to say about this? Or what is the, you know, other facilities going to do? What's the government's going to say? They would think about all the various institutions and power bases that existed in the community and how they would react to their various plans. Once the healthcare consumers became an integral part of the community and established itself as that, providers began thinking about, well, what are the healthcare consumers going to say? And we would get phone calls, which always sort of shocked us, saying, oh, we've got some plans, we'd like to meet with you and talk to you about that. And suddenly there was a sense that the relationships were changed, that suddenly the institutions that existed felt the need to consult with people in the community, to talk to them, to seek their advice, to seek their input. Sometimes it was very superficial, but again there was this relationship, the power had altered, and there was a sense of an alternative source of power in the community they needed to consult. Other examples for me are like UCAN, United Citizen Neighbor, which is in the North End community surrounding Carle Hospital. For years, Carle would expand and do whatever they wanted to do up there. Once UCAN began organizing residents and talking about it, Carle, and we don't always win, but Carle was always considering, what does UCAN want? What does the neighborhood want? And before it was just this sort of diffuse group of people who lived around Carle, and how do we get it through the city council, but it wasn't so much what's the neighborhood going to feel. So that's really the sort of the third thing in organizing, is thinking about how we're building institutions so that we can alter those relationships of power so that it lasts beyond any of us as individuals and is always functioning in the community. I guess one of the things that I always feel great about is that when I'm long gone, the healthcare consumers will still be here and still be a voice for people. And another thing that's part of creating institutions like IDF or healthcare consumers or other groups in town is that it becomes a vehicle for change. I mean, what's exciting about groups is that when people have issues and they want to do something about it, they can go to an organization that has resources, there's leaders, there's experience that they can to bring their issue to the forefront. And over the years, Healthcare Consumers has always been that for people who want to do it. Am I running out of water? Great, thank you very much. How am I doing? Am I doing all right? I forgot to say, I've lived now in Champaign-Urbana for most of my life, about 20-some years. But I'm really from the south side of Chicago, and I talk real fast. So if you haven't noticed, and what I usually say is I talk fast and it's like going downhill, so I pick up speed as I'm going. So it's always good to interrupt me with questions, and it sort of serves as a speed bump for me and slows me up a little bit. So feel free to jump in at some point. A couple of things I guess I want to touch on too before we just have a give and take of questions and comments. It's just some of the lessons, some of the things that, you know, from my perspective might be useful for people who are looking at being activists for their career, their life. One of them that to me is critical and that is often, I think it's too narrow. You know, I think diversity is an issue that our society faces on a lot of levels. And I think we need to respect diversity. And I think people who are in progressive organizations tend to think of that. And too often, though, it's just narrowly defined in terms of diversity. Diversity is something that maybe is the color of our skin or our sex or sort of demographic criteria about us as individuals. And I believe in that kind of diversity, and we need that kind of diversity. But diversity also goes to our values, that we have to respect other people who might be different from us. I mean, I think too often in a progressive community and among activists, there's, you know, well, we do it this way, and I don't like the way they do it. And I think it's important for us to respect a wide range of ways that people try and bring about change in the world. And it's really important. There are not enough of us who are fighting for social justice that we can isolate ourselves from others who are doing it. And not everyone does it the same way. I was trained through the Midwest Academy, which sort of has a Saul Alinsky angle to it. There's a variety of other organizing schools and trainings. There's a lot of ways that people approach it. People may know of John Lee Johnson, who I've worked with over the years, and I have incredible respect for John. He does things very different from me, but I think it's important that that diversity of approaches is also respected, and that we have to be able to allow people and organizations to tackle issues they want to do, and to support them, to speak well of them, to encourage them, even though they may do it different from us. And I think it's a mistake too often. We get very parochial about how we go about organizing and what we do in terms of that. So I think we need to broaden our definition of diversity beyond just demographics to include values and also approaches and styles. Part of that is avoiding infighting. One of the most frustrating things that I dislike most about organizing is when there tends to be infighting. And I think it's important that we try and have broad appeal to people, and that we try and respect each other's differences and approaches to that. It's inevitable, I guess, in some ways that there are going to be different viewpoints and there'll be some infighting, but I would encourage all of you to try and mend those wounds and build bridges to organizations and others who, you know, we're all in the same struggle, and it's important that we respect everyone and their approach to it and try and bridge that and build some strength out of the different ways that we do it. Another lesson I think is important is sometimes we try and change people by telling them what is right and how they ought to view the world. And, oh, it's this way, you don't understand it. And people really, I certainly do, you learn from doing, you learn from your mistakes, you learn from participating. And I think organizing transforms people. I just think it changes them. And so if we only let the people who come to our events and who we will organize as already being pure and sharing our values and our views only, then we leave out most of the world and we don't give people the opportunity to change. I've changed a lot over the years, and again, for me, one of the most inspiring things, the thing that gives me energy, is seeing other people go through the transformation of understanding the world differently. Again, sort of an example was back in again, going back to the 80s, when Public Action was a statewide organization here. We were doing some stuff around deregulation of natural gas and big oil. There was this big oil day protest, and our congressman back then was a guy named Dan Crane. Anyone remember Dan? Wonderful man. He was a very conservative gentleman, a very right-wing Republican who was our congressman for a short period of time. Fortunately, it was short. But he was one of the people who was very much for the big oil companies and making sure that the marketplace served their interests, and oftentimes hurting the interests of average consumers. So we had this big rally over at Dan's congressional office in downtown Champaign. There were probably about 100 people there, and outside there's sort of we went over there, and a protest that was going on was being replicated around the country in different communities. And we wanted to go to our congressman's office, and we had some demands. We wanted to talk to him and explain how his votes for the oil companies was hurting senior citizens and middle-income families in our community. And it was a great event, and we went into his office, and he was back there, but he won't come out and talk to us, and sort of this very intense interaction with his staff outside. And at one point he came out and just started yelling and screaming at everyone, and people wanted to get their say into the congressman. But the important thing was later on, we went back to the office for sort of a debriefing, and I remember there was this guy who was there who was from one of the small rural communities in Champaign County, never been to a protest before, but he was angry as hell about his utility bill and how high it was going. And we were sort of going through this debriefing and everything, and after it sort of left, and he sort of hung around the meeting a little bit later, and he came up to me and he says, "You know, that was really cool. mean, I've never been to this stuff. I've never done this before. And he said, but you know, those black women who were sitting over there, I've never talked to a black person before. And I just had this image, but they were just like me. And he was, I mean, he's just sort of, he needed to share this with someone that, and it was Louise White. And if anyone knew Louise White, she was a wonderful woman. And she was a senior citizen in her 60s, but Louise was just a fireball. And he just really fed off of her energy. And again, it was an opportunity that he had never had before. And so he just went on and talked about how it really changed how he viewed, God, you know, I considered myself a Republican, but, you know, it's not making sense anymore. And I see these are people who agree with me. And you could just see that it was sort of opened up his eyes in terms of how he viewed the world and how he experienced it. And again, organizing is what transformed people. If I would have caught that guy and discussed race with him or talked to him about how he shouldn't be this way and he should view that way, we would have probably argued all night long. But when he had the opportunity to be there and to be shoulder to shoulder with other people who shared his values and who shared his pain and wanted the same things that he wanted, he started questioning how he had always viewed the world or how it was presented to him. So I think we have to be open to a wide range of people who don't always agree with us on everything and make sure that they're participating or have opportunities to participate in what we do. So that they can make a difference and so that they can be transformed by the efforts of organizing. I do want to get to questions, but I guess I want to say about some things, there's sort of the three parts I was supposed to talk about, and this is the last piece, about what we in our community can do to further the development of activists and build activists in amongst our midst. And I guess two of the issues that I think 25 years, 30 years of doing this and dealing with organizations and the struggles that we face, the most valuable resources, and the ones we don't have, are people and oftentimes money. And I think one of the things that I would like to see undertaken and something that I've thought a little bit about and would like to have is something that we might, as a community, want to explore, is building a fund of money that can be available for just sort of small seed money. So when people want to take on an issue in their community, they want to tackle something, that there might be small grants that we can give out to sort of initiate and encourage people to do organizing. Also, the fund could be something that provides interns where students, I mean, I was a student at the university, and if it wasn't for a professor named Barry Checkaway who had some sense of what organizing was and the value of students being involved in the community and committed to that, I don't know what my experience would have been. I don't know that I would have been as proactive about getting out and involved in the community. But we need to find students, provide opportunities for them to get involved in our community so that the university, which is over there, isn't distant from the community, which is over here. And finding ways to make that so that students can earn a living while doing that over the summer or during the semester, I think would be a valuable thing. And then also I think we need to stroke and encourage people who are within the university. Oftentimes it's going to be a professor, but it doesn't have to be, who take advantage. I mean, we're in a community where there is a billion-dollar institution there that has incredible resources. One of its things is community service, and we need to be supporting and encouraging and recognizing those individuals at that institution who try and make those resources available to the people in the community who often don't have a voice. You know, the university does a good job of making sure that corporations have research done for them and that the kinds of things that they want development on the fringes of our community are done. But we need to find and support those people in the university who realize that those kinds of resources can also go to sort of the voiceless and people who don't have power in our community. And make sure that they're doing that. So I think those are the kinds of things that we can begin thinking about and working together to make possible. So those are the end of my official remarks, but we'll open it up to questions.
So, donations. I'm just going to pass this around. If you have any spare change you could put in here. All the money will go to support the Illinois Disciples Foundation and the work of our programs. So anything you have would be appreciated.
Cool. Fundraising, very important. Be sure to support it.
I think my favorite question, Matt.
Yeah.
I feel frustrated. I get Jim Hightower's little monthly newsletter, The Lowdown, you know. And this last one, he talked about all the nasty things that happened in Washington, all the lobbyists coming in and writing on September 11th, you know, ponytail. And I just felt so frustrated that, you know, there's really big industries out there taking advantage of taxpayers and peons. And so how, you know, community organizing I know is so much different, but how do you suggest, like, people kind of battle the big guys, and is there I don't know, any real way of making your voices heard on a national level like that?
Well, I mean, there are efforts, I think, at the national level, people who are fighting sort of the globalization or making sure that globalization is more democratic as it proceeds. So I think there are ways, healthcare consumers as a group, when we started in the late 70s, the concept of national healthcare was on its way out. I mean, it wasn't even going to be talked about from when we started in 77 through the early 90s when it started to reemerge as an issue. So during that time, one of the questions was, well, we should be working on national health care. I think one of the problems of just focusing at that level only is the ability to affect that change. So for average people, I mean, unless you're going to win national health care out of Champaign-Urbana, you're missing where people are at. So there are people who are being denied health care. There are people. So from my perspective, you have to start where people are and address those issues there. There's always the dream, from the civil rights movement and how it was a national movement, or the labor movement was a national movement. I'm not sure any of us as individual organizers actually have the ability to create a movement. So I think from my perspective, I'm doing it, thinking, oh great, there's going to be a movement soon. And then sometimes it comes and then like national health care then showed up in the early 90s, and like I think I was quoted in the News Gazette saying, they were asking what will happen by the end of the 1990s, and so my quote was, we'll have national health care. So I don't know a lot about these things, but even when it seems like the movement's finally coming, it disappears real quickly. I think it's important, I mean, at least for me, it's just you keep your eye focused on what it can be winnable and what you do, and that I think of social movements and major change like that are sort of like waves that go through society, and we just want to be ready to ride the wave when it comes. So that laying the groundwork, doing the things so our organizations are prepared, and then when that's coming, when those big changes, you can push the envelope and carry it a little bit further. So, I don't, when I was younger, I sort of had these visions of this national movement that we will build as organizers, individuals, building organizations. I'm not convinced that any individual organizer can do that. So I tend to think of focusing on the short term, focusing on what we can win in our community, and out of that come larger movements, and that we push it forward. So that's sort of my thing. Yes?
You talked about organizing people around concrete things that would lead to concrete changes in their lives, and I think I can see things that would in long term lead to that, but in the short term, I'm having trouble. I'm thinking about the anti-cheat movement as one thing. I mean, it's a racist mascot. Well, your education will be better, the climate of the university will be better if it's removed. But people, what's that going to do for me tomorrow? And then some of the work around Columbia, another example, and international anti-sweatshop movements. How, especially in the union movement, Buy American. Well, how is me fighting for better wages in another country going to help me tomorrow? So eventually it would, but I don't know if you have any advice for getting people to see, themselves as part of a more connected group.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I have any short-term advice on those particular issues in terms of how you do it, but I do think, I mean, depending on the struggle that's going on, it is important to think about sort of short-term victories and translating that. I mean, getting those people together and say, how does this make a difference in people's lives? And I think, it doesn't eliminate idealism, so, part of it is, it's sort of based on the concept of self-interest. Why am I going to get involved? I'm going to get involved because it's going to make my life better. I'm not going to have to pay that bill that I don't owe and stuff like that. But there is also a level of idealism that I think, particularly with younger people, where they're motivated by making the world a better place for other people. And so I don't think that that's something that can't be taken advantage of in terms of trying to engage people and get them involved and understanding that it's making real... I mean, I think what motivates some people is it makes a real difference in someone's life if it's not theirs immediately, and so that's what's going to transform. I mean, why do you do stuff is really, it's got to be something that's real, and it's going to, I think it makes a difference. I just think over time, if you're just protesting something and it isn't concrete, then it's hard to sustain that.
The living wage passed last night at the county board. A lot of people were there. But people stood up and said, I'm willing to pay more taxes so that people could be paid a living wage, and I thought that was pretty incredible.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your techniques for getting initial groups of people together that have a shared common interest. Do you go door to door in a certain neighborhood that's of concern? Do you get people to have, do you identify someone in their neighborhood to have a party at their house to invite their neighbors to talk about concerns? Do you have membership lists of organizations? Do you use the phone? How do you get those initial groups of interested people?
No, I think once you have an issue or is it a problem, the question usually is sort of based on the idea of make life better for people and make some real improvements is, well, who would benefit if this were to change? And then go and find those people. So it isn't, you know, in traditional neighborhood organizing, it is like with UCAN, it was people were upset about cars from Carl and all the expansion, the traffic going on. They wanted a stop sign. So then you can go door to door and you can talk to people about we need a stop sign here and come to a meeting. Let's talk about it. With other issues, people are more diffuse and they're not sort of geographically located. So then it's just thinking in, I think, a little more creative ways. So when healthcare consumers started looking at Hilburton, which was a program that hospitals got money to expand their facilities, their obligation was to provide a reasonable amount of free and low-cost care to people. Well, none of them were really doing that. But so when we started hearing about it, it was like, well, we want to change that. We know they're not following this. So the question is, well, who will benefit if the hospitals start providing a reasonable amount of free and low-cost care to people who are deserving of it? Well, there's going to be poor people. Well, where are they at? And what we ended up doing was saying, well, you know, hospitals, when people owe them money, sue them. And so we went over to the small claims court, and we just went down and got all the names of people who were being sued by Carl, Burnham, and Mercy at the time. And we got literally hundreds of names, I think like 600 names. We then went to the phone book, started looking them up. We only got about 200 phone numbers. Then we started calling people up and say, hi, I'm with the Healthcare Consumers. I understand you're being sued by Carl or Burnham or Mercy Hospital. Did they ever tell you about your right to have that bill waived? No. Well, we're having a meeting next Tuesday, and we're hoping you might be able to come because a lot of people who have been taken to court and they're being asked to pay this money and they didn't have to pay it in the first place. So I was like, well, I think I can make that meeting. You know, I was like, we'll put off. Back then, I think Dallas was on TV. I'll skip Dallas this Friday or whatever it's going to be, and I'm going to go to that meeting. So I think it's sort of like that. I mean, similarly, when you're working on birth control, well, who's going to be? Well, there's going to be women at the university who don't have the birth control troubles. Let's go find them, and how do you do that? So I think you sort of need to think about, well, who will benefit from this, and then creatively go after and identify those people who might do it. There's a group that I worked with called Families Advocating Injury Reduction, which was people who had been injured or someone they loved who had been injured through medical malpractice, through workplace injuries, sort of through no fault of their own. And it was like, so we're working on this, where do we find people? And so we went to lawyers who represented people who had been injured and hurt and said, hey, would you do a mailing to your clients and tell them about our organization and doing it that way? So I just think it's sort of figuring out, you know, it is sort of, if you've got a geographic thing, you can go door to door, but a lot of times issues you're working on are not geographic, so you have to think about how you find those people. Question?
How do you create sustainable groups? How do you avoid being seen as the central person that has to be there, and then the group can't be sustained for you to go on and start another group? I mean, how do you sort of maybe disengage yourself or train people or get enough people to take over your role so that you're not in?
Sure. Well, I'd like to know the answer to that myself first. You know, I mean, it's a struggle, I think, but part of it is you're looking for other people who have leadership skills and are interested to step up and doing that and encouraging them and trying to delegate some responsibilities for that. So, I mean, I think good organizers are always looking for potential leaders to lead and to take over and to do that. So, I mean, part of it's that. And I remember this one time, and it was on the Mercy thing, you know, we're sitting there and we're going after Ron Ulsh and everything, and I'm sort of, you know, a young organizer, who's going to be my leader, who's going to be here? And there was this one woman, Helen Smith, and Helen, you know, someone said, oh, you ought to get Helen involved with this, and she'd be really good. And so I like working with Helen, it was really good. And we're at this meeting with Mr. Aldrich, and Helen's sort of sitting there, and so I'm like, go ahead, I'll do it. She's kind of shy and not want to do it. And then Helen's mom came along with her, and her name was Mamie Smith. And she stood up at that meeting, and she had our demands, and she said, well, wait, how about this one? What about this one? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do this? And so she sort of emerged, and I'm still looking at Helen, and so the next meeting happened, I'm meeting with Helen beforehand, and then that meeting, Mamie stands up again and sort of takes over the meeting, and I'm thinking Helen, and there's Mamie, and it's like, oh, wake up, Mike, there's Mamie. Mamie's the person who's doing this. So part of it is trying to be honest and not be too... what's the word I want to say, or controlling about stuff, but observing, listening, and watching, and so you find people, and hopefully they'll emerge and do that. It's always a struggle to do it. I mean, you know, I don't think I do it all that well, actually, in terms of that. I mean, there's been some successes, and so organizations do it, but I don't think it's it's a simple thing. I think there are things where, in general, not so much, gee, so that I'm less important and that other people are doing that, but it's a larger issue, and that is where there is the ability of an organization to have many people participate in it. That example I gave where we were in the healthcare consumers, and it was early on, we first got involved in stuff around this health planning stuff. So there was these HSAs, health systems agencies, or agencies set up by the federal government, and their job was to regulate health planning and to overlook all the stuff that's going on. So again, in sort of the naive young organizer's mind, it's like, oh, this is really good because the law requires that the boards of these health systems agencies represent the community as a whole. So there should be minorities, there should be women, there should be rural, there should be poor. So wow, everyone has self-interest in this, and that was sort of my, gee, this is a great issue because everyone has self-interest. And the truth of the matter is, after about 2 years of organizing around this stuff, and you look around the room, and it's all sort of middle-class university people. And what I never realized going into that was, yeah, you know, poor people don't really care about health planning because it's just paper. It's just all this talk about all these, you know, ratios and, you know, investments. They care about the fact that they're being turned away and can't get into the hospital to get their health care. And women, you know, as a group, they don't necessarily care about health systems agencies and all that stuff. They care about their choices of when they want to have birthing options. They care about DES. I mean, those are the things they're doing. So part of it is really understanding what are issues that are central to people. And I think organizations over time have to have a diversity of issues, that you can't just have one thing. And if you put all of your eggs in one basket, at some point that's going to run dry and you're going to be sitting there. And so with healthcare consumers, we had this sort of, you know, I remember looking around the room, I was just sort of bummed out because I just thought I was organizing poor people and other stuff. And there was all these university people, and nothing against university people, I was one of them too. But it was like, why? And part of it was, well, why are all these people here? Well, because they're academics and they understand planning and they're into that and they understand all this dynamic. So that's who was attracted by it. That's who's self-interest. They were doing research themselves in these areas, so they came out to that. And then it was understanding, and one of the reasons we got into Medicaid stuff is, well, how come there are no poor people here? Well, poor people could care less about this. They don't care if they have a seat on the board. They care about getting health care. So then it was trying to find, well, what's an issue that poor people care about? And that's when we got into Medicaid discrimination. What issues affect women? And we got involved in DES and later trying to bring midwives into it. So it was trying to identify people's self-interest and address those issues in ways that then they want to come in. And once you start getting a variety of issues going on, then you bring in different kinds of people. And I think that, again, that diversity makes the organization stronger. I don't know if that completely answers your question. Yeah.
You've spoken a lot about trying to get people into an organization or getting an organization started. How do you, once you get somebody into the organization, get them to sort of move on to a higher level of not just coming to a meeting, but actually organizing meetings or organizing protests or doing a lot of the day-to-day work that really sucks, like making fundraising calls or doing all that kind of stuff?
You can never get people to like make fundraising calls. You know, it's the same thing. I mean, and part of it is taking the tasks and being successful at it. I mean, some people are really good at fundraising. There's Elizabeth here. Elizabeth. And finding what people's interests are. And again, it's sort of like what's their self-interest on issues, but then who has what talents. Some people are really good at chairing a meeting, and they should be encouraged to do that. Other people really don't want that spotlight, but are glad to do the folding and doing some of the grunt work. I think, again, it's sort of creating opportunities for people to be able to do it. But again, it's, you know, none of this stuff is magical. There isn't like, oh, I know the answer to do this. It's just hard work. And it's being good to people and taking care of them and trying to nurture them and thanking them for coming and encouraging them. I think a lot of times, if I were to critique myself, I don't spend enough time helping people feel comfortable with the kinds of things that we want them to do, so they sort of get thrown into the fire and go for it, you can do it. And then they fail, and then they get bummed out, and then they stop coming and stuff like that. So when you know, in organizing, neighborhood organizing, sort of like start with the stop sign. But why do you start with the stop sign? Well, because you can probably win a stop sign. It's an easy thing, and you build people's confidence. And then once people, again, sense that I can make a difference, then you can move on to more complicated things. I think that probably is true with volunteers and stuff like that, is giving people some sense of success. I think one of the things that activists, organizers really need to do is be positive and upbeat, be a cheerleader at times. I mean, because, you know, you all be at meetings where people are like, oh, this sucks, I don't want to do this anymore. Where's everyone at? I mean, so it's, how come I'm on? Well, I think we ought to just kick everyone off the board who doesn't come to 4 meetings in a year. And it's sort of this downward spiral. So I think it's keeping it positive. You know, if people aren't at the meeting, then there mustn't have been a good reason for them to be at the meeting. I mean, people will come if it's worth them coming. And so sort of rethinking, okay, well, what would make people feel good? And again, you can fool yourself, well, we'll have this thing and they're all interested in that, like I used to do around health system. Oh, everyone cares about this issue. But it's sort of really what motivates people and what do they respond to, and I think that's really sort of at the core of people getting involved and staying involved.
I think Claudia's beginnings are kind of an answer to him in a sense. If you want to recap how Claudia got involved with the hotline, right?
The public
Health campaign.
Yeah.
That's right. Claudia came fairly new in town, I think. A little while. From IDF. I don't know the Claudia story. How the hell did you get involved, Claudia? But was a volunteer in the campaign for public health department. Got very involved in that, and then I think applied for one of the organizing jobs, and now she's heading up the organization and doing a wonderful job. So I think that, I mean, the thing about healthcare, because when I think of over the years of all the people who have sort of come and participated and moved on, it's very exciting. I mean, on a staff level, there are people all over the country who used to work with healthcare consumers, as well as just in the community. And I think that's, part of the challenge too, is keeping it moving, keeping it changing. We all get a little bit old and a little bit stale, so it's nice to get new blood into an organization. New issues bring in new blood. I mean, there's all kinds of campaigns when they were fighting for the Sydney Clinic, and Mercy didn't want to undo that, and so suddenly people in Sydney who don't necessarily think of themselves as people who would associate with some of the other healthcare issues had a vehicle by which they could address something that was very dear to them and they cared very much about. They wanted that clinic, and Provena or Covenant, whoever they were at the time, were shutting it down. So I think all those things, yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I don't know, it's keeping your eyes and ears open and listening to people. My mom used to say this thing that I think for me has been very helpful, and she used to say, I mean, this was back in the 60s when there was, when the Black Panthers were doing stuff, and so I was sort of middle-class family. I mean, we were liberal Catholics, but certainly not radicals. And so we would have these talks about it, and she would say, well, I can understand it, but I can't condone it. I understand why they feel that way, but I can't condone it. And sort of what she was saying to me is that she really understood what people were feeling. She knew why they were doing it. I mean, she didn't always agree with what they did. But so I was saying, you got to understand people. You have to know why and how they feel. So I think listening to people and knowing them and trying to pick up on what they're good at, if they're a volunteer, but also what kind of issues will do it is really important to that. So it's always good to understand them, even if you don't condone what they're doing. Yes, Jeff.
So the issue of doing this for a living, of actually surviving and making money. So what moved you? At what point did you realize that you wanted to do this for a living or make a living while doing social justice work? And what advice do you give for people who are thinking, maybe they're in college now or afterwards and thinking about, well, they want to have a career that makes a difference, but also need to, survive, pay the rent?
Well, one thing is, I think I'm an example that you can have I think I live a great middle-class lifestyle, and I'm an organizer, so it doesn't have to be poverty. But I do think, and when I was at the U of I sort of went through this thing where I think you have to make a conscious decision that that's what you want to do, that you have to sort of say, this is what I enjoy doing, this is what I believe in, this is what makes me feel good, this is what I want to do, because there's so many temptations, and there's so many, there'll be people come and say, well, I want to do this for a couple of years, and you sort of set yourself up, I think, sometimes to only do it for a couple of years, because you only see it as I want to do this before I get my real job. And I think you have to make that conscious commitment that you really want to do it, because you will pass up other kinds of, I mean, when I came to the U of I, my goal was get my degree, do really good in school, and go to law school and be a lawyer. And, maybe do something good as a lawyer, but, I just wanted to be as a lawyer. And when I decided that I wanted to do this, I remember sitting down talking to Loretta, who's now my wife, and just saying, I think this is what I want to do, and so I'm not going to pursue graduate school, and I'm not going to do this. I'm going to make the commitment to this. And I think you have to make a conscious decision with yourself that that's what you want to do, because it'll help you later on when you're trying to weigh. My dad was a Reagan Republican, worked in the back of the yard, and then became a small meat packer businessman. He just couldn't understand what the hell I was doing. And, well, when are you going to get a job? I mean, this is nice, but, why don't you come and work with me? And, but it was always a sense of, well, if you're not making money, I mean, that's how our society really measures you. You're making a lot of money, and people out there evaluate us by, well, how much money are you making, and what are you doing, and what's your title? And I think you have to make a conscious decision to not care about those things because they're all around us and they're always sort of the standards by which we're measured if we're successful or not. So to me, I just remember this one point in my life when I said, no, I think this is it, and I'm going to pass on these other things because this is what I want to do. So I do think you have to make a conscious decision in terms of doing it. But I also, again, I've raised a family and 3 kids in college. I mean, you can't do that with, it's not necessarily poverty wages. So, I mean, there is a real opportunity, and you can do it for a living and have a career. And so I don't know. I guess I feel like it's doable, but you have to commit yourself, and you have to make a conscious decision that you want to do that work or this work. And if you don't, you kind of fool yourselves, and eventually you'll get frustrated because of your other expectations or people whispering in your ear about what the other things that you should be doing are. I think the other thing that actually helps too is that I have a family that's been from my mom and my dad who believe in this also, so that I have a dad and a dad. My dad, who was a Republican, was not my stepfather, who worked with Alinsky. So I had very different dads. But in terms of my stepfather and my mom, they were always very supportive of this, and they stroked you and made you feel good about it. And then I've had a family that I think also my wife and then all my kids are very supportive and understand it and sort of believe it, and so that makes it easier too. It's not like you're sort of struggling against what people around you want you to do.
I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit more about how you live your family life, because I know from working with you that your family comes out to protest. They're very supportive. Monty was right when she was doing the introduction and saying that there's a lot of support there as well. I know they have their own social justice commitments, and so they do that. But I also know, from working with you, you work a lot of hours. Are running around like crazy all the time, but it seems to me like you made a very conscious commitment to spend time with your family, and I was wondering if you talk about it, if that's the case, and then how if you have to work to sustain that, and maybe how that also sustains you and your work.
Well, it definitely sustains me and my work in terms of, it's not easy, and it's stressful. And, there are a whole bunch of the world who just hate you. I mean, that's one thing you got to get used to. I mean, people walk around and think I have a tail and horns. And so there's that. Oh, my God. And so in my family, though, that's sort of my refuge. And I can go home and in our house and the kids. And so, I mean, to me, that's what sort of re-energizes me in terms of that. So to me, it's sort of a sacred place where I get all kinds of positive energy. There's also part of me that's very strong on... I feel like, I don't know how often I successfully do it, but I feel like ultimately, when we're faced with our maker and we're going along or whatever, it's the people who you touch, and for me the closest group of people are my wife and my kids and my parents and my sisters, and so that's really critical in terms of how, if I value stuff, that's the most important thing to me, and that's really... I remember early, some point in time, someone said something to someone else about, well, Mike Doyle, he never comes to our events. And it's like, oh my God, I feel like I should be doing this and that. But there's this point where it's like, I do what I can do, but I've got to be there. I want to be home, have dinner every night at my house if I can, sleep in my bed at night with my wife. That's really important to me. And those are sort of things that are sort of like first things that I want to take care of. I don't know how well I do that. I know tonight when I showed up late and, running around and getting out, that I think sometimes you take those who are closest to you and who love you for granted. So I'd be nervous if my wife saw this. She'd say, well, you may try, but you don't always succeed. But it is what I care about probably the most. So it is very important to me in terms of family life. Yeah?
I work for you.
I'm sorry. For you.
I was somewhere and they was like, oh, you work for Mike Doyle. Oh, did you know he delivered all his kids? I'm like, what? So is there any truth to that story about you delivering your children?
Yes. All of our kids were born at home. My wife delivered our kids. I was there. midwife, we had no doctor, so I had some role, but I don't want to take any credit away from her and her ability to do that. But yeah, you know, and yes, it's true. They were all born at home, and then that probably helps with the bonding a little bit. Those 4 births were just emotionally charged, and they have to change your life when you see birth in front of you with your kids, and that's a pretty powerful experience.
Well, was your wife trained in prenatal care?
No.
Did you have any professional assistance at all in prenatal?
No. My wife, when there was a home birth group, so we had support of other people who were having births at home. But you know, I mean, we think of, oh, you have to be born in a hospital, but hospitals have been around for what? Not even 100 years. And humanity's been around for millions of years. So somehow we had these babies before we had hospitals.
That support group, some of those had professional training in that.
You know, in the home birth group that we were in, there weren't too many midwives around. There weren't lay midwives at the time our kids were being born, and there weren't any official nurse midwives that they would allow practice. My wife was just, she's not big on hospitals and didn't think that that was the best environment to deliver our kids, and said, I'm going to have our kids at home. And I thought, oh. So, you know, you're having them, so I'm with you, and what do we have to do? And you can become, I mean, you know, part of it, it's like organizing, you know, it's like, oh, you can't. Well, I mean, in the sense of sort of taking hold of your life and being responsible for it. Learning how to do it, doing that stuff. I sort of like, it's, you know, we're human. I mean, you know, the dogs and the cats are having them without hospitals, and they do just fine. So humans actually are, it's safer to have your baby at home if it's a non-high-risk birth. This is my personal belief.
How do you determine that? How much risk you're encountering? In primitive times, there was death in childbirth, not so long ago, just a generation or 2 ago.
Well,
how do you assess the risk?
Well, I will answer this quickly, but then we should talk afterwards, because not everyone will want to know about my philosophy of birth. But there's ways of doing it, and you get, you know, here are the signs, these are the things, you know, you get your prenatal care, there's certain signs, and if the signs are positive, you can have your baby at home. And my wife our children were born in, you know, the thing on TV, that never happened in any of our births. It was this peaceful, and she was in touch with her body, and she just moved those babies down and out, and it was the most amazing thing to see, and you appreciate what it is. And so, you know, I'm a big believer in home births, but I'll talk in more detail about that later, probably. Bill and then.
Yeah, this might be a topic.
We're free roaming.
I've been working for volunteering with healthcare consumers for a while on the task forces. One of the treats for us who, when we first started and had no experience, was getting you to come and talk about some of your experiences in terms of how we should strategize to accomplish goals. So one of the things I always liked was the 5-finger strategy. I wonder if you could talk a little about that, or anything else.
Anything about that? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in organizing, I always equate it to chess, although I'm not a very good chess player. I remember when I learned how to play chess, who was 72? Who was the guy? It was Eddie Fisher. Was that Eddie Fisher? Bobby Fischer. Searching for Bobby Fischer. But, you know, I used to play my roommate at Northern Illinois my first year of college, and he used to just wipe me up. And part of it was I was always looking, well, what's my next move? And the one thing I learned from him, although I only beat him once, was that he was 4 moves ahead of me. So he's thinking of all the different things. And I think in organizing, it's very much a chess game. When there's an institution and you want something and you want to get that institution to do it, I mean, it's how do you create an environment where the institution wants to give you what you want. And so creating that environment is really sort of the challenge. So it ends up being very interesting tactically and strategically. So I say 5 fingers. If you put all of your eggs in one basket and you lose, or it doesn't work, or it doesn't have any legs and doesn't carry anywhere, you're stuck. So you should always have 5 different ways of which you're tackling an issue, and you're thinking about it. And some of you might be doing background research on, but you want to be able to go at a target from a variety of ways. You know, you might want to get a referendum on the ballot so to create some public debate. You might want to be asking this public body to do something. So, hesitant to get too much on a specific issue, which I guess I could, but it's that I would say you ought to be able to say, well, we've got 5 different ways that we're approaching this issue, 5 different targets for what we want to do, and we're sort of pursuing them all, but some might have fruition and some might not, but you want to not leave yourself sort of boxed in. I also think that someone was asking how do you find people, and so there are, let me go through what the 5 questions that I think if you're going to organize around an issue. One is, you know, what's the problem? What is it that you want to change? And it's really getting people to think about, if you were the emperor, what would you want? And so that you don't get too caught up into how the world defines the problems for us. So that's one thing, is sort of what's the problem. Then, oh, I can't even read my own notes here. Whose problem is it? Well, let me go with what's the problem, and sort of the second part of that is what's the solution? Again, if you were emperor, what would you change and what do you want? So you don't get too caught up into what you think you can win, but decide what you want to have. Then whose problem is it, was the question you were asking. I mean, who cares about winning this? If we get what we want, who's going to be thrilled and happy? Because that's who you want to go to and talk to them about, hey, this is what we want to do. Do you want the same kind of thing? And then the fourth question is, who can solve the problem? I mean, once you say, well, this is what the problem is, this is what we would want to do, this is who will benefit if we get that, then the question is, well, who can give us that? Who can solve the problem? And that's where sort of the 5 fingers starts coming, is, well, there's a variety of people who might be. We might be able to pass it as state legislation. We might be able to get the institution just through the goodness of their heart or the pressure from the community to agree to give it to you. So there's a variety of ways of which people can give you what you want. So you want to have those different targets for your organizing and have that. And then the last one is, what are the things that target that you want to go after, what do they care about? So what buttons can you push that will motivate them to be able to do that? So I guess what I haven't done a lot talking about is sort of the real specifics of strategic planning and trying to come up with a variety of targets and how you begin to mobilize around those targets. You know, there's things like the actions and the reaction. I mean, rarely in organizing do you care about the action, but what's important is how they're going to react to you. So that you want to, I mean, remember this time with, oh God, I'm going into too many war stories. It's a good one. One time with the hospitals, they were doing this stuff on Hilbert, so they had this responsibility to give a reasonable amount of free and low-cost care. And we knew they weren't doing it. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to sort of draw them out a little bit. And the thing about institutions is that they'll often give you the rhetoric about, well, of course, you know, we only do it if we run the hospital like he runs the hospital. It's like, well, great. Let's start looking at what's going on and seeing if that's the way he would vote on it. And so part of it is to get the institution to react to your claims and charges. And once they react, they usually say something that sets you up, and then that gives you the next action which to follow on. So, and that's like it in chess. Like if you're playing someone who's good at chess, they move this pawn over here, and you think, oh, good, I'm going to take him. And then, bam, they get you from the other direction. So it's always in chess is the actions and the reaction. Same thing as organizing. You want to get your target to somehow commit or do something, and then that's like, you can have your choice, sort of like your choice of poisons. Do you want to go this way, and we'll fight you this way, or do you want to go that way? But they sort of, you sort of lead them into a place where you can counterattack. Sounds like war.
I was just going to ask that, does it always feel that antagonistic and like a conquest, or do you sometimes move into a position where when you deal with the people on the other side, you realize they just didn't understand the issue at hand or how it was having an effect, and that they end up wanting to change? I mean, do you convince the enemy, or do you just beat the enemy?
No, I mean, I guess when I was younger, it was probably like beat the enemy. Oh, let's go get him and do it. I think, I honestly believe that rarely are people doing it out of evil and hate. I mean, there are some institutions and organizations that might do that. But I think generally institutions operate out of their self-interest. And you have to understand what their self-interest is, and then create an environment with their self-interest is to do what you want to do. So, for example, when Carl was expanding over in North Urbana, this was a few years back, and they wanted to build and they wanted to create an institution. They're very proud of it. They're working very hard to make a very good healthcare facility and do what they want to do. The neighborhood around it tends to be a low-income, low to moderate-income neighborhood. The people who live there, those who live there, we love our neighborhood, and it's vibrant, and it's diverse, and it's exciting, and so we like that. Now the thing is, an institution that's big and wants to do something, their goal really is to assure that they can have a stable, growing environment. So one of the things that Carl was doing is that they were buying up all the properties around their hospital, not because they needed it right now, but because when they do need it to build that building, they don't want to have to pay you know, the high price for this house because they need it because they have to build a building. So they're trying to buy up the land early on. Good business sense. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with that in and of itself, and it makes sense to go about and do that. The problem is what happens is it starts to spiral. So if they're out there buying up houses, who wants to live there? And so people think, well, Carl's going to buy this up, and I'm going to. So the people who are encouraged to also buy houses are speculators, people who want to buy a house because they want to make a killing when Carl wants to own that property. So that's another good business decision from someone who's looking to invest their little bit of money and own a house. But they don't want to live there. They want to sell it to Carl someday, so they're going to rent it out. But they know that Carl isn't going to buy that house because it's all nice and fixed up. They're going to buy it because they're going to tear it down. So the landlord doesn't care. They're going to do it for speculating. So then they start buying up the properties. Carl's trying to buy up the properties. People who want to live in a nice neighborhood or stable and it's not going to be torn down and live next to a hospital, they're not buying it. So it's created a coal environment which, out of no one's ill will, but out of good business sense, is creating an environment where a neighborhood's deteriorating, housing prices are falling. Carl doesn't have a self-interest in fixing up the house because someday they're going to tear it down. So they let it run down. Well, it just happens that when everyone starts letting their houses run down, the value of my house, which I might be doing a nice job fixing up, it's also going down. And so then it's easier for them to buy. So there's sort of a disincentive in the marketplace to fix up houses to make it nice. So again, I don't think that's evil and bad. What UCAN's challenge was to create an environment now that they want to expand to say, we're not against you expanding. What we want to do is take what you want. You want to make a nice neighborhood. You want to have a city that grows. You want to have all the stuff and the city officials want. We want to do the same thing, but we want to make sure that who pays for it, because right now the neighborhood, or at that time, is incurring all the costs of this. Carl's getting property cheap and the value of our homes are decreasing. And we want to share in the benefits of it. So we want to redefine what the give and take of this is. And so for the neighborhood group, it was coalescing around our group interests and trying to change that. And so the things we didn't try and do is just stop the hospital and beat them, because I don't know that how possible it is. What we want to do is create an environment where there were alternative approaches, so that we think, gee, houses are deteriorating. We think that the city and Carl, if you really care about this neighborhood, Carl's houses ought to be inspected all the time so that that house are kept up to snuff, and invest in the neighborhood. I mean, you drive around Carl and all the landscaping crews, there's nice flowers, there's grass. Then you look at the rental properties, and they look like crap, to be very honest with you. And so it's like, well, no, invest in those properties as well as in this. So the dynamic really came for us, the challenge of creating an environment where Carl could have what they want, but the give and take between the neighborhood was one in which we would also be protected. We would share in some of the benefits, and they would share in some of the costs. So what we tried to do was not just beat them until they said, sorry, we're not going to build anymore, but let's get to the point where our voices are being heard, and there's an alternative, and let's negotiate that. Let's talk about how we can do that. So the things that the neighborhood came up with is that the city should inspect all Carl's rental properties, and Carl will bring all the rental properties up to code, which no other landlord in the city of Urbana-Champaign ever has to do, but here they're going to agree to that. That's a cost that they're going to have to pay that they didn't have to pay before. We think Carl and the city should put money into a neighborhood investment fund that can help other homeowners to fix up their homes. It's a cost that they have to pay. It's a benefit that we get because so that everyone sort of gets something and gives. So I'm always trying to change the rate of exchange between institutions, not trying to be not in my backyard approach, but let's understand that you have self-interest, we have self-interest, and let's negotiate. And what happened in UCAN is that the neighborhood group, people were mad and they didn't want Carl to have what they, let's stop them no matter what. But it's sort of like, let's be figuring out what we can get and let's negotiate and let's get a settlement where we're getting some stuff and Carl's going to get some of what they want. So for us, I mean, in all these things, if you read at this thing, and Imani was very involved in, we were marching on Christie, we had certain demands, we wanted stuff, but it really came down to negotiations. Of course, their CEO got fired, I think, by agreeing to negotiate with us. But it was sort of, well, what are the policies? What can you change? You say you don't want to hurt people, but what about this and what about that? And so I think it's important that we not just be protesting for the sake of protesting and stopping it, we're against it. I think that it's about building power. And really, ultimately, when you have a certain amount of power, it's sort of like, here's all the power and here's all we have. What we want to do is level the playing field a little bit and then negotiate some settlement so that we're getting something out of it. And I think that's part of this sense of people getting something that they will benefit from. It really has to come out of negotiations. And so that means you're giving stuff up, but you're getting something for people, and then you move on to the next issue. So I think I know it's perceived by people with power in the community that we're naysayers and we're just against stuff. But I think in most of the stuff that we're involved in, it's pushing for what we want. I remember when this stuff was going on with Carl, city council member kept saying, well, what do you want? Well, what do you want? And our answer was, well, we want as best as we can get. So we don't have, we'll accept this. It's if we have enough power to get that, we'll want more. So it's sort of weighing what you can get and then negotiating it out so that you walk away with something. would guess so. I mean, you know, I mean, I don't think I'm that thoughtful about it. It usually happens rather than I have this master plan of 6 organizations. It's that, you know, I think one of the most difficult things in the work that I've done over the years is saying no to people. I have the inability to do that. So it's like, oh, well, that sounds good. Oh, yeah, let's start doing it. And suddenly I feel like we're being sucked off into a new project and a new thing. So I'm guessing that there'll probably be other things coming, but it's not like I have a plan. It's much more reactionary than proactive. Yeah.
Do you find more success if you have a one-issue group, if you're trying to focus on 1 or 2 issues, and then you just organize people around that?
Well, I think you have to be focused so that there's some focus to your efforts rather than being spread all over. But I think in the long run that organizations need to have some diversity to what they're doing. Because again, it's sort of, and again with healthcare consumers, we started on this health planning stuff and it's like it appealed to this part of the population. Now, healthcare consumers always works on healthcare issues, excuse me, but there are healthcare issues as they're perceived by low-income people and what they face. There's women's health issues. There's a variety of constituencies that have health issues and concerns. And so I think one of the strengths of healthcare consumers has been the ability to keep a variety of issues going forward, whether it's the public health, whether it's fighting for the birth control, whether it's dental care. So I think there's a value because what happens, every issue sort of dies, you get so far, you get to the point where you've negotiated a settlement, well, what's next? So you always have to have sort of a set of, I mean, I think if building an organization, which is different from organizing around a campaign, you need to have sort of a set of issues that will appeal to a broader set of people. So even in organizations like healthcare consumers that are around healthcare, I think you want to have a variety of constituencies that might be interested in it and are there for a variety of issues. If you just work on one issue and wait till it's over with, the group may very well just disperse and close before, you know, fold its tent because, oh, we're here. So I think if you're trying to build an institution that will exist in the community on an ongoing basis, it has to have sort of a broader diversity. You know, Families Against Advocating for Injury Reduction, there were people with medical malpractice and how they were affected. There were people affected by injuries at work. There were people whose families were torn apart because of defective products and stuff like that. So I think it is good to have that because you never know when a leader will leave and change or an issue will just sort of run into a brick wall, and you want to have another issue there where the organization can sort of change its focus and move on and not stagnate and get stuck on one thing. So I think it is better to have multiple things. Long-winded way of saying that. Other questions?
If somebody would like to give to your group, I noticed I picked up this brochure. And on the back it folds out into a little name address, and we can just fill this out, and then your group is Illinois Center under Community Empowerment.
Sure. Got your checkbooks now before you yeah, I mean, the Public Interest Fund, which was another effort to where there's lots of good groups who do a lot of things, but we're often cut off from the money because groups who fight for change often aren't the ones who have access to the pot of money. And so Public Interest Fund was really created as a way for all of us to support those organizations that don't have the more traditional and acceptable modes of operation. And so supporting them is always a good thing because they're always the ones that get sort of shortchanged on resources. And I think there's some of those out, if I'm not mistaken. They're out there in the hallways, the little blue brochures. Always welcome contributions.
Right.
Other questions? We're running out of time.
Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm here
Talking
till...
about the money issue, because I have this love-hate relationship with finances, which I think a lot of activists do, because I don't want to deal with the budget, I don't deal with money, but you need it to run your organization. What's been like effective ways of fundraising for you and getting activists to be able to, I mean, I know Public Interest Fund was started in a way to help with that, but maybe just talk about your vision of fundraising.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if my reputation that much is like this, but when I was director of healthcare consumers for a while, I mean, anytime we would have an event or an issue or anything, my thing was, okay, so how are we raising money around this thing? So I think it's like, you know, money's important and it helps our organizations. It's fuel that we need bodies and people, but you need money. And I think one of the biggest mistakes of organizations and people who are working for change is because we see people with power and money, and we despise that sometimes and how it's used to their benefit and to dump on other people, that we tend to look at the money and say, well, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to, you know, almighty dollar approach to stuff. At the same time, if you're going to build organizations, you have to have money. And I think one of the most, if you go to fundraising stuff, they'll say this, but I think it's really true, is that we forget how good people feel about giving money. That if people, if people don't want to give, you should thank them, you should be appreciative, that's okay, it's not a problem. But if you don't ask for money from people, they will not give you money generally. I mean, someone needs to say, hey, will you help us out, will you do this? And I think it's useful to always connect your fundraising to the work that you're doing, because that's what motivates people to do it. But it's also true that there's a lot of people who aren't going to be activists, they're not going to be coming to meetings, they won't do that, but the one way that they can help and they can contribute is to sit down and write a check. And when I give to people, sometimes I think, oh God, I can't afford to do this, but I always feel good when I give the check. I always feel good about it. I mean, it makes me feel like, okay, I wasn't able to do this, but I can help in that way. And I think, and if you forget that, then you don't want to ask people for money. Oh, well, don't ask for, well, just make it $2 or $3. It's not important. I mean, there are people who give you a $100 check, and if you ask for $25, you'll get $25. And then the $75 that they would have given you, or the $100 would have given you, it's not going toward the work that you want to do. So I'm always big on asking for $100 and asking for money, because if you believe in what you want and what you're doing, people will support you. And I think people do feel good about doing it, and we can't be afraid of doing that. The other thing that I think too often happens is, well, we'll get grants. We'll get grants. And the other thing is that a lot of groups try and get money from government grants and stuff like that. Unfortunately, money there is strings always attached to it. And when you get money from someone, there's an accountability to them, as there should be. A foundation gives you money, you're accountable to them to do the work. If the government's giving you money, you're accountable to them to do that. So if you're an organization that's getting money like that, one, you always have to realize that if you're challenging the powers that be, there's a good chance that the first thing they'll try and do is cut off your money. And almost all the groups I work with who got money that way lost it. Healthcare Consumers was doing this great organizing around Hilbert, and then setting up the Medicare 100 Plus program. And one place we were getting money was from the Catholic Church Campaign for Human Development, which only supports community organizing in low-income communities, and it's geared toward organizing and challenging institutions. Well, that's a good thing, unless one of the institutions you're challenging is the Catholic Church. Then it's not such a good idea. And so our local bishop, and the vicar general at the time, later became our bishop, said, when he got a call from Mercy Hospital, said, well, we're not going to give you any more money, even though we had the highest rated project in this diocese and the only one that had ever been funded, and we're doing great work. That thing got cut midstream, and the people in D.C. who awarded the grant said, we really want to support you, but the bishop says no, so we can't do it. So you always have to be ready that they're going to cut you off if you're doing it. At least face it, you can. Organizing. Went on to organize for the incinerator and shutting down the incinerators at Carl and Covenant. Got a grant from the Campaign for Human Development to organize in low-income communities. After 1 year, the bishop said, no, you got by us again, and they cut us off again. So that people with power know people with money, and there's a good chance that you will lose your money. The other thing it says is that if you're getting money, you're accountable to them, and then you have to deliver for them. And a lot of groups get in the business of sort of chasing grants. Oh, well, we'll get this grant. Well, they want to fund this, so we can do that, and then we're doing that. And I always say, it's important to recognize that there's nothing wrong with knowing it, but make conscious decisions about where you're going for money. And I'm not even against taking money from groups like the government. If the city of Urbana wants to give UCAN a grant, that's great. They may cut us off, and we just need to recognize it, but as long as they'll give it to us and we're committed and don't sell ourselves out for the money, that's okay. But you have to be ready for it. The other thing, though, is where you really want to get money from is people, because that's where you're accountable then. I mean, the accountability to the powers that be in the government or the foundations that give you money is true, but when Healthcare Consumers gets 30 or 50% of its budget from individuals, well, the last thing you want to do is make those people unhappy. So you find yourself, are we delivering? And if you start ignoring their needs and don't address their issues, they will stop giving you money. And so that sort of keeps you accountable to them. So I think it's important to realize that money makes you accountable to whoever gives it to you, and who the hell you want to be accountable to. And once you understand that, then that's who you want to get money from, because that will keep you, keeps you honest. It'll keep you accountable to the people. So I think I'm big on diversity of funding, get as many different ways of raising money, always do fundraising events, and don't forget to ask people to support you, because when you ask, then people give. So, other questions?